Everyone is celebrating right now. The headlines are declaring victory. The analysts on television are talking about regime change and mission accomplished and the death of a supreme leader, as though killing one man ends a war that was never really about one man. And while everyone is celebrating, the mathematics of what is actually happening are quietly making the outcome of this conflict inevitable. This is not about ideology. This is not about who is right and who is wrong. This is about numbers, cold, brutal, unarguable numbers that do not care about political narratives or victory speeches or newspaper headlines. Stay with me through this entire video because by the end of it, you will understand why the most important story of this conflict is not being covered by anyone who has a financial or political reason to avoid telling it to you. Let us start with the single most important number in this entire conflict, because once you understand it, everything else clicks into place immediately. Iran produces approximately 100 ballistic missiles every single month. 100. That production capacity sits inside underground facilities, distributed manufacturing networks, and supply chains that were specifically designed over 2 decades to survive American airstrikes. Now, here is the number on the other side of that equation. The United States and Israel combined can produce 6 to 7 missile interceptors per month. 6 to 7 against 100. That ratio is not a military challenge. That is a mathematical conclusion. You cannot sustain a defensive posture against an adversary who is outproducing your defensive capacity by a factor of 15 to 1. The stockpiles drain faster than they refill, and at some point, the missiles that were being intercepted start getting through. That point is not a future theoretical scenario. Based on current consumption rates, it is a near-term operational reality. Now, let me give you the cost dimension, because this is where the economics of this conflict become genuinely extraordinary. An Iranian ballistic missile costs approximately $100,000 to produce. $100,000. That is the offensive weapon. The interceptor fired to destroy that missile costs between $80,000 at the lower end for certain systems and $12 to $13 million at the upper end for the most advanced American interceptors. Read that again. $13 million to stop a $100,000 missile. Iran spends $100,000. The defense spends $13 million for every single exchange, at scale, across hundreds of missiles per volley. This is not a sustainable economic equation for the defending side. This is a deliberate strategic design by the attacking side. Iran did not stumble into this asymmetry. Iran spent 20 years engineering it specifically because they understood that the path to outlasting American military power was not matching it weapon for weapon. It was making the cost of defending against Iranian weapons economically unbearable over time. The stockpile data that is beginning to emerge from this conflict confirms that the strategy is working exactly as designed. Within 12 days of a previous conflict, the United States burned through between 20 and 25% of its entire advanced interceptor stockpile, not 25% of one system. 25% of the total available inventory of the most sophisticated missile defense technology America possesses. That was 12 days. We are now past day 5 of the current operation. Reports are already emerging that at least one Gulf ally is running critically low on interceptors and requesting emergency resupply from American stocks. Reports are already emerging that Israel may need to begin rationing its own interceptor use before the end of the current week. Rationing. The word rationing applied to missile defense systems during an active conflict where the adversary is still producing and launching is not a tactical inconvenience. It is the beginning of the end of the defensive equation that the entire military strategy depends on. Now here is what happens when the interceptor stockpiles run low enough that the calculus of what to shoot down and what to let through becomes a real operational decision. Iranian missiles begin reaching targets that were previously being stopped. And the targets Iran has demonstrated it is willing to hit are not empty desert installations or symbolic military targets. Oil infrastructure across the Gulf worth trillions of dollars in global economic output. Airport facilities that serve as the commercial and logistical backbone of Gulf economies. Port infrastructure through which an extraordinary percentage of global trade passes. Financial centers whose stability underwrites enormous volumes of international capital. This is not random targeting. This is a deliberate campaign to make the economic cost of continuing the conflict higher than any Gulf state government can justify to its own population and its own financial stakeholders. Iran is not trying to defeat the American military in a conventional exchange. Iran is trying to make defending the Gulf states more expensive than anyone is willing to keep paying. Those are two completely different strategic objectives, and the second one is far more achievable than the first. The Gulf states themselves understand this better than Washington appears to. These are countries that did not ask for this conflict. They were hosting American military infrastructure as part of a security arrangement that was supposed to protect them. The arrangement is now producing the opposite outcome. Iranian missiles are hitting their facilities precisely because American bases sit on their soil. The diplomatic signals coming from the Gulf reflect exactly this calculation. ambassadors being recalled, public statements of neutrality from countries that were previously reliable partners in the regional security architecture, quiet diplomatic outreach through intermediary channels to explore what a negotiated off-ramp might look like before the economic damage becomes irreversible. These are not the signals of allies who believe the current trajectory leads somewhere they want to go. These are the signals of governments that are beginning to calculate whether the American security umbrella is producing more risk than protection and whether a different arrangement might serve their interests better. That calculation, playing out simultaneously across multiple Gulf capitals, is arguably the most strategically significant development of this entire conflict, and it is receiving almost no coverage in Western media. Now I want to walk you through the game theory of the position this creates for Washington, because the options available are fewer and more painful than the public framing of this conflict suggests. The first option is to continue the current operation and maintain the commitment to Gulf state defense. This requires interceptor production to scale dramatically and immediately to match Iranian missile production. The industrial base to do that does not currently exist. Building it takes years, not weeks. So continuing the current operation without solving the production equation means accepting that Iranian missiles will increasingly get through, and the infrastructure destruction in the Gulf will accelerate. The second option is to escalate to ground operations to eliminate the missile production and launch capacity at its source. This requires congressional authorization that the current political environment makes extraordinarily unlikely. It requires a public support base for a ground invasion of Iran that polling data suggests does not exist by an enormous margin. And it requires a post-conflict governance plan for what comes after, which brings us directly back to the most fundamental unanswered question of this entire operation. The third option is managed withdrawal. Declare the achieved military objectives, cite the demonstrated degradation of Iranian military capacity, and begin the process of drawing down American involvement while framing the transition as a success. The timeline language that has already been used publicly, language about completing the operation within a defined period, is structurally consistent with preparing the political ground for exactly this outcome. None of these options produce the result that the victory celebrations currently playing out in public suggest is imminent, and the mathematics of the Interceptor equation constrain the timeline within which the choice between them has to be made. Let me give you the historical parallel that makes this strategic situation most legible, because history has run this experiment before and the results are documented. Germany maintained air superiority over Britain for 8 months during the Second World War, sustained bombing campaigns against industrial, civilian, and infrastructure targets. Enormous damage inflicted, and Britain did not surrender. Because air power alone, regardless of how overwhelming and sustained, cannot force political capitulation from a population committed to resistance without the ground component that converts military destruction into territorial control. Vietnam demonstrated the same principle a generation later: total American air superiority, bombing campaigns of a scale and duration that exceeded anything previously attempted. And the political will to continue the conflict collapsed in Washington before the military capacity to sustain it did. The lesson both cases teach is consistent and unambiguous. Air power can destroy, it cannot occupy, it can degrade, it cannot control. And against an adversary whose strategy is explicitly designed to outlast rather than outfight, the question of who controls the air becomes secondary to the question of who can sustain the economic and political cost of the conflict longer. Iran does not need to defeat the United States militarily. Iran needs to survive American military pressure long enough for the economics to force a recalculation in Washington. Based on the Interceptor math and the Gulf state diplomatic signals, that strategy is producing results. Now, I want to connect this military and strategic picture to the financial dimension that touches every person watching this video, regardless of their proximity to the conflict itself. The Gulf states sit at the center of the architecture that keeps the global dollar system functioning. Oil revenues denominated in dollars flow into Gulf sovereign wealth funds and central bank reserves. Those reserves recycle back into American treasury markets, American equity markets, and American real estate. The mechanism keeps the dollar strong, keeps American borrowing costs lower than they would otherwise be, and underpins the financial stability that the entire Western economic system depends on. That mechanism requires one foundational condition. The Gulf states must be able to guarantee the security of their oil production and export infrastructure. A Gulf state whose oil facilities are under active missile attack and whose port infrastructure is being systematically targeted cannot make that guarantee. A Gulf state whose government is calculating whether the American security umbrella is producing more danger than protection cannot be relied upon to maintain the financial arrangements that the petrodollar system depends on. The moment Gulf governments begin seriously exploring alternative security arrangements with powers that can actually provide what America currently cannot, the financial architecture shifts. Dollar recycling slows, alternative currency arrangements for oil trade expand. The reserve currency status that has underpinned American economic privilege for 8 decades comes under pressure from a direction and through a mechanism that is difficult to counter militarily. This is the final layer of Iran's strategic design, not just to make the military cost of this conflict unsustainable, but to create the conditions under which the financial architecture that makes American global power possible begins to fray at its most fundamental level. The celebration happening right now in certain capitals is based on a reading of this conflict that is focused on what has been destroyed and who has been killed. Those are real and significant military achievements. Nobody is disputing that. But the question that determines the strategic outcome of this conflict is not what has been destroyed. The question is what comes next. Who fills the governance vacuum? How long the Interceptor stockpiles last? Whether Gulf state governments maintain their alignment with the American security framework or begin the quiet process of hedging toward alternatives. Whether the petrodollar recycling mechanism survives the economic damage being inflicted on Gulf infrastructure. Killing a leader does not answer any of those questions. It never has. Iraq demonstrated this. Libya demonstrated this. Every case in which the removal of a government's leadership was treated as the conclusion of a conflict rather than the beginning of its most difficult phase demonstrated this. The missile production facilities are still producing. The distributed command networks are still functioning. The proxy relationships across the region are still active. And the population that might otherwise have been indifferent or even sympathetic to regime change is now unified around national survival in a way that no externally imposed political transition can easily work with. The war was not lost because the military campaign failed. The military campaign has achieved significant results. The war is being lost because the economic equation does not work, the production math does not work, and the strategic endgame was never clearly defined in terms that the available tools can actually deliver. The Interceptor math does not lie. The production ratio does not lie. The Gulf state diplomatic signals do not lie. The historical precedents do not lie. Every one of those data points points in the same direction. The question is not whether the current trajectory is sustainable. It is not. The question is how long it takes for that conclusion to become impossible to avoid in the public framing of this conflict, and how much economic damage accumulates in the Gulf, in global energy markets, and in the financial architecture that connects this conflict to your daily life in the meantime. The celebration will continue for a while longer. The victory language will remain dominant in the coverage for days or weeks more. But the mathematics were always going to have the final word. They always do.